Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you case number 188 in the Best Way to Do Cataract Surgery series. This is a white and intumescent and free-floating cataract. I use trypan blue and then double chop and cross chop. So I'm going to share with you why I believe double chop and cross chop and mechanical fracturing techniques are the safest technique in this situation. Again, when you have a white and intumescent lens and you remove that peripheral lens material, this is essentially a free-floating cataract, i.e. almost like a Morgagnonian cataract situation. So use a cotton tip to steady the eye, and this is a corneal marker which will help me to center and size rhexis. And using that cotton tip to steady the eye, go ahead and make my paracentesis incision, first on the right side and then the left side, making sure I'm parallel to the iris plane, which creates a nice corneal shelf, which will allow me to achieve a self-sealing incision. This is intracameral lidocaine and then some intracameral epinephrine. And this is some air and then trypan blue. So I'm painting the anterior capsule surface with trypan blue under the air bubble. You can see the chamber is collapsing because, again, this patient has a pretty big lens and probably some level of zonular laxity as well. This is dispersive viscoelastic, which will help to coat the corneal endothelium and to flatten the anterior capsule. And this is a triplanar corneal incision. I make a vertical groove, place the blade into the deep part of the groove, tunnel through the cornea, and with the help of the cannula, I'm able to control the eye, and then I enter. So I'm using the 25 gauge needle puncture technique. I'm going to puncture the center of the anterior capsule through a paracentesis incision, and then I'm going to aspirate. And what I'm trying to do is aspirate that liquid milk. You can see as I'm doing that, you can see some changes to the appearance of the lens, especially on that left side. And so there is some decompression of the capsular bag. Again, you have an intumescent lens. If there's high intracapsular pressure, it can cause a radialization of the capsule and the dreaded Argentinian flag. So I was able to get a tear, but it went the other way. So I'm going to follow and go clockwise and follow where the tear wanted to go. And you want to make sure you don't get too big of a rhexis in these cases. If you make the rhexis too big, then it's going to cause more convexity to the anterior capsule surface, and that increases your risk for the Argentinian flag. You saw that I got to the edge of the mid-peripheral lens and it was about to radialize. I was able to pull it more centrally and it was able to prevent the radialization force to go all the way out to the periphery. So I was fortunate there, finished off the rhexis, and this is the Capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I place a cannula under the rhexis edge contra-incisionally. Of course, this is a white lens. The lens is going to be super loose anyways. Remove that bubble, and then, of course, the lens begins to spin. Again, with that fluffy cortical material, it's essentially disengaged and disassociated from the capsular bag. Irrigate the surface of the eye, lifting the incision with a chopper, going in with irrigation off to minimize Descemet's trauma, removing the surface epinuclear material, placing the chopper under the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally, bringing the instruments together, and it fractures the lens in half. That is the double chop. Just teasing it apart. Placing the chopper around the right heminucleus, hooking the peripheral lens, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip, fracturing the lens against the phaco tip, and that is cross chop. Using some vacuum to lift that first quadrant up, crushing the lens between the instruments, sandwiching the lens between the instruments, crushing the lens into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. Using fracturing forces to crush the lens into smaller pieces, thereby utilizing less ultrasonic energy and vacuum. So let's see this in slow motion. I'm pronating the instrument, getting around the lens contra-incisionally with the chopper, turning it vertical, turning the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally, getting the instruments around the lens, Being able to get around the lens, I'm able to sandwich it from either side with opposing forces and then crushing the lens in half, and that's double chop. And then using the chopper to tease and pull and pull and pull the left side heminucleus from the right heminucleus. And then pronating the chopper, sliding it under the rhexis edge around the right heminucleus, turning it vertical, hooking the peripheral lens, pulling it central toward the ficotip, and then fracturing the lens against the ficotip. You saw that sudden loss of resistance, and that is the fracturing of the right heminucleus, and the ficotip is acting like a chopping block. So when you do cross chop, the ficotip is acting like a chopping block, and that provides more cutting leverage, cutting force for that chopper. Lifting that first quadrant up and crushing the lens between the instruments, using mechanical forces to crush the lens into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens piece. Getting around the lens with the chopper, hooking the lens from the periphery, and then crushing the lens between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. So again, this patient had pretty mobile lens, a white cataract intumescent lens. I'm able to execute lens disassembly with double chop, cross chop, and using mechanical fracturing forces. I turned that lens piece, separating that second quadrant from the rest of the lens, hooking the peripheral lens, performing another cross chop maneuver, crushing the lens against the ficotip like a chopping block. Using some vacuum to lift that fragment up, crushing the lens between the instruments into smaller and smaller pieces. And once the pieces are small enough, then emulsify the lens pieces. Turning the second heminucleus in front of me. Again, you can see the lens is very loose, placing the chopper around the lens, hooking the peripheral lens, pulling it central toward the ficotip, again, crushing the lens against the ficotip like a chopping block, doing the same maneuver around the third quadrant, crushing the lens between the instruments, again, with the cross chop maneuver. Lifting that fragment up out of the bag, crushing the lens between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens piece. Using some vacuum to grab that fragment up, crushing the lens between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens piece. This is the last quadrant, placing the chopper around the lens, hooking the peripheral lens, crushing it against the ficotip, using some vacuum to grab that piece up, sandwiching the lens between the instruments, crushing it between the instruments, mobilizing the lens pieces, crushing the lens again into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. You can see I like to emulsify while there's pieces of lens that are still in the bag to protect the posterior capsule. So this is the final fragment, using some vacuum to position the lens piece, and then using the instruments to crush the lens in half, and then crushing it into smaller pieces. Remember, when I'm crushing the lens, I'm not actually applying any vacuum or ultrasonic energy in those moments, because when I crush it, both instruments are essentially acting as a chopper. I keep the chopper deep as I remove the last fragments to make sure I protect the posterior capsule. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and I go in with the ironing handpiece, activate irrigation, start sub-incisionally removing the cortical material from anterior to posterior. By doing it this way, you're able to get a cleaner peeling of the cortical material off the bag. Switch to polish mode, polishing underneath the rhexis edge and polishing the lens epithelial cells off, polishing the posterior capsule as well. Again, because of the polymer tip, this is a very safe way to polish the posterior capsule and underneath the rhexis edge. You always have to be mindful of the very fine cortical wisps that are often found in these cases. Pulsing the subincisional capsule fornix with the BSS cannula, you saw it liberated some of that material that is deep into the capsule fornix. Again, start off removing the cortex from anterior to posterior. If you've removed all the anterior lens material, then you can go after anything that's adherent to the posterior capsule, and then you can pulse with the BSS into the fornix. Filling the bag with cohesive viscoelastic, turning off the irrigation first, filling the capsular bag with the cohesive viscoelastic, and I'm just showing here that the sweeper, one of the ends of the sweeper, the tip broke off. So I alerted my staff, using the sweep to polish underneath the rhexis edge, removing the lens epithelial cells. You can see subincisionally there's quite a bit of lens material that I'm able to mobilize and free up, and sweeping it out of the capsular fornix subincisionally. Because the sweeper is broken, rather than waiting for another sweep, I go ahead and use the same side of the sweeper to sweep both sides. Using the cannula to hold the eye steady, and this is the injector. This is a single piece acrylic lens. It's going into the capsular bag. Going in with irrigation off, activating irrigation, disengaging the haptics off the optic, getting underneath the optic, tilting it, and rotating it 90 degrees clockwise, removing all the viscoelastic from within the bag. Switching to polish mode, polishing underneath the rhexis edge. Switching to visco mode, removing all the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber, and then I'll hydrate my incision. So again, this is a patient with a white intumescent cataract. You saw a 25 gauge needle central puncture technique, which basically punctures in the central anterior lens capsule, and then you aspirate real quickly to get rid of that liquefied milk. That helps to decompress the capsular bag, which helps to alleviate and reduce the risk for a sudden Argentinian flag sign. Unfortunately, some of that milk can still remain and be this fluffy material that's in the peripheral anterior lens capsule. And if you're not careful, you can get radialization forces and get a run out. But this is quite different from that sudden split of the capsule with the Argentinian flag. Nonetheless, this case went well. I was able to go clockwise instead of my normal counterclockwise with the rhexis, and I applied central forces, essentially a little maneuver, to make sure that the rhexis was still as round and central as I can. You saw the double chop, cross chop mechanical fracturing techniques, utilizing reduced amounts of ultrasonic energy in vacuum. This was essentially almost like a Morgagnian cataract, a free-floating lens piece, but positioning the instruments around the lens piece and using and leveraging mechanical fracturing techniques to crush the lens into smaller and smaller pieces. This patient did quite well, had a nice clear cornea post-op day 1, and the patient saw dramatically better after removing this swollen and white intumescent cataract. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.